Alright, what's going on, guys? Okay, so today's video is talking about the drop step, or dropping your weight, okay? Sitting down on your punches. So that's another way that's kind of described. And it's similar to the weight shift we did in Essential Movements, one of the earlier volumes, okay? But it's very similar, but you get wider. You widen your stance, you drop your weight a little bit more. So think about if someone were to try to push you over, you sink your weight and you can absorb that push, and sometimes they'll get pushed back, okay? If you lean forward enough back into their push, okay? So that's a similar kind of concept here. You become like almost dead weight right at the point of impact. And that adds a lot more power into your punch, okay? So this is another way of generating power, right? So the weight shift is something that it's hard for people to grasp. It's very hard to learn at first. Not a lot of people, I think, really know how to teach it. But, in the U.S. and Mexico, they seem to really understand this dropping your weight concept. That's one of the first things you hear teachers or trainers in the U.S. teaching their fighters to add power. They say sit down on your punches, and that's what they're talking about here, okay? So in Jack Dempsey's book Championship Fighting, he calls it the drop step, okay? So it's a very similar concept, and he teaches it a very specific way, and that's kind of to get familiar with the move. To me, they're the same thing. The way he teaches it, and then you learn the feel of the move, and then it becomes a much more subtle thing in application, okay? But the way he demonstrates it, and he calls it the drop step, right? But to me, that's the same thing as dropping your weight, okay? It's very similar, at least. In application, it becomes much more subtle sometimes. It's not always this big drop your weight, okay? But to understand what I'm talking about, think about Canelo. That's a really good example of someone who really drops their weight and gets these big, huge punches. When he really wants to throw bombs, he widens his stance a little bit, and he gets a little lower than normal, and he gets these big circular movements, and that helps generate big weight shifts into his punches, okay? And he drops his weight, he sinks down a little bit more and puts more power on his shots, okay? Okay, so check it out. Alright, like all the other movements in this series, I'm going to start squared up. I want to learn these movements just from a completely squared up stance because it's symmetrical, right? It's easier to get the coordination and learn the balance of the moves from this position, okay? So I'm pretty much completely squared up, and just like the weight shift from volume 1, I shift my weight. Look, shifting my weight from foot to foot, right? Make that a little bit more subtle. Now to drop my weight, I might get a little wider. I bend my knees more. I sit down a little bit more. But it's basically the same move, okay? Boom, boom, boom. Even on your straights, boom. You sit down a little bit more. Okay? Adds a lot more power to your punches, okay? What you can also do is you sit down on a shot, you might jump out, kind of pop out of a shot for the next one, okay? Boom! Okay? So that's a different way of generating power. That'll be another video coming up, okay? So that is the drop step. It's not terribly complicated. Like I was saying, most people, this is kind of the first way they really grasp on how to generate power. And once you practice it from this stance, then when you get in your fight stance, start moving around, it'll feel more comfortable. So it's the same thing applies. Once you get in your normal stance, you just, when you want to sit down on your punches, you maybe get a little wider, you're sinking a little lower, you're dropping your weight more. Like if someone was going to try to push you, you drop your weight and lean into the push. That's the same kind of concept. You drop your weight so there's nowhere for the weight to go. It can't get pushed back into you. And that's, you know, the form of the punch goes right along with the drop in the weight, and it creates a very strong structure. Alright? So it's not always about muscling, pushing things through, you know, forcing things. You use your kinetic chain and you drop your weight, and now there's a very strong skeletal structure behind your punch. Everything's lined up and you got your base dropped in, sunk in, so the power is basically forced to go into the target. Okay? Alright, so as I mentioned earlier in Jack Dempsey's book, he talks about, he calls it the drop step. So it's a very similar thing. To me, they're pretty much the same thing. You can differentiate them into two separate things. To me, it's the same concept. You're generating power by sinking down lower, okay? Like I was saying earlier, that you can, there's another way of generating power by going up. That's another video, okay? But to sink lower like this, the way Jack Dempsey teaches it, it's kind of confusing the way, the wording in the book. So a lot of people kind of get their own idea of what it is, and if it's not the same as yours, it's not a big deal, alright? These are just names of things. What you want to just learn, you want to learn the concept, okay? You want to learn the concept. Don't get so worried about the names of these things, okay? So get the concept of generating more power by dropping down lower, and that's what we're talking about here, okay? So you got the weight shift. You shift your weight from leg to leg. And then if you drop down lower, you're just sinking down a little bit more, widening your base a little bit more, and it adds more power to your shot. But the way Dempsey teaches it in his book is he says this. He tells you to get pretty much in a normal kind of staggered stance like this. And he says to lean over your lead leg, okay? So you just lean over your lead leg until you're almost ready to fall over, and then you take a step. So that's what he says. So watch, if I lean like this, I take a step, and then you catch yourself, and that's how he teaches this concept, okay? But like he says in the book, this is just an exercise to learn it. When you actually do it in the ring, it's a much more subtle kind of motion, okay? Step forward with a punch, and you drop down a little bit, okay? So, I'll try it on the bag and see if you can see if it makes a little bit more sense. So, he says you lean forward, leaning over the leg, and then you take a step. With that same foot, I take a little step. So I push a little bit off my back leg, but I'm really just kind of falling. That's why he calls it the falling step. And you fall into the shot, okay? But that's the concept here. Getting those steps, weight shifts, and you add a little drop in your weight, boom! It adds more power to the weight shift, okay? Alright, so try it out. Let me know what you think. Like the video, sub the channel. Peace.